Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a pretty incredible journey to demystify some of the most complex ecological and climate terminology out there. We're going to take that massive, intimidating wall of jargon you always see in environmental reports and break it right down. We're taking it from microscopic natural processes all the way up to the heights of global policy. So if you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by the technical language of climate science, well, you are absolutely in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with Earth's natural rhythms, move into the biological frontier, figure out measuring our impacts, and finally look at global climate action. Starting us off with Section 1, Earth's natural rhythms, the baselines of biology. Before we even start looking at human impact, we really have to understand how nature operates in the extremes. Notice the direct contrast here in how animals survive. Aestivation is basically how animals avoid drying out in severe arid heat. Hibernation, on the other hand, is the response to extreme winter cold and a lack of food. But here's the genuinely fascinating takeaway. In hibernation, it's actually the animal's lowered metabolic rate that causes the temperature drop in their body, not the other way around. Their internal engine literally slows down first. And this beautifully illustrates how nature balances itself out in aquatic environments. Oligotrophic lakes are those stunningly clear bodies of water, the ones making up the pristine drinking water we rely on every day. And that's precisely because they are low in nutrients and algal production. Contrast that with mesotrophic lakes, which have an intermediate nutrient level that allows for submerged aquatic plants. This sets a vital baseline for us, It shows exactly what healthy, naturally balanced aquatic ecosystems look like before any human interference alters those nutrient levels. Now, just like animals and lakes, plants have incredibly rigid boundaries for survival. A calcifuge simply cannot survive in alkaline soil, while a calcicle absolutely will not tolerate acidic soil. These are incredibly strict chemical boundaries right in the dirt beneath our feet, and they dictate exactly what can grow where. And this perfectly transitions into how these plant boundaries scale up to create massive, distinct geographical zones. Which brings us to ecozones. These are vast, vast areas on Earth where life has evolved in relative isolation for incredibly long periods of time. They're locked in by massive geographic barriers, things like deep oceans, high mountain ranges, or broad deserts. The flora and fauna here adapt perfectly to their specific baseline conditions. But you really have to wonder, what happens when these deeply isolated, finely tuned natural ecozones are suddenly disrupted or exploited? That takes us to Section 2, the biological frontier. How humans interact with nature. When we talk about our interaction with biology, intention is literally everything. Look at bioprospecting. That's the search for new biological samples, which can happen ethically or, unethically. Because when indigenous materials and knowledge are patented for commercial gain without any compensation, it crosses the line into biopiracy. On the flip side, we have incredible innovations. Things like biobanks for cryogenic storage and the bioweb, which is an amazing technological leap that extends sensory devices directly into nature, creating an actual internet of living things. However, we have to acknowledge that our profound interaction with the biological frontier has a pretty solemn consequence. When our actions cause isolated animal populations to diminish, they suffer from genetic erosion, basically losing their very gene pool. And this genetic erosion feeds directly into a devastating reality, the Holocene extinction. This is an ongoing extinction event that has been quietly but steadily accelerating since 10,000 BC. It's not all doom and gloom, though. We do have defense mechanisms against this. When we fracture habitats with things like roads, logging, and human development, we can implement biolink zones and wildlife corridors. Think of these green corridors as crucial bridges. They allow isolated wildlife populations to physically reach each other. And that physical connection, it allows for the exchange of individuals, preventing inbreeding and really fighting back against that dangerous genetic erosion we just talked about. But get this, our human footprint isn't just physical roads. It is increasingly microscopic. With the rise of plasticulture and agriculture and the heavy use of nanomaterials, our technology is literally scaling down to the quantum level. And because these tiny materials have completely unique properties compared to their larger versions, we've had to invent entirely new fields of science like nanotoxicology just to measure the toxicity of this invisible footprint. So now that we've explored the biological frontier, how do we actually measure our specific footprint? That's Section 3, measuring our impact, calculating the damage. The crucial point here is this. We almost always focus on our primary footprint. The direct emissions we control, like the gas in our cars or the energy heating our homes. But actually, simply reducing our driving isn't enough. Our secondary footprint represents the indirect emissions from the entire life cycle of the products we use. It proves that the more we buy and consume, the more carbon emissions are being manufactured and transported entirely on our behalf. So to balance our, let's call it a carbon diet, we naturally look to plant trees. But the language we use here really matters. Reforestation is the restocking of woodlands that have been depleted. Afforestation, on the other hand, is the establishment of a completely new forest in an area where there historically wasn't one before. Both are super vital tools for sure, but they represent very different ecological interventions. And speaking of trees, how do we legally define a forest? Well, it actually comes down to incredibly strict bureaucratic metrics. On a plot of land that is over 1 hectare, if the tree canopy covers more than 10%, it qualifies as official forest cover. Under that 10% threshold, it's merely designated as tree cover. It sounds pedantic, but these highly specific metrics are absolutely essential for scientists who are trying to track our global progress. So all these measurements, our footprint, our forests, they all feed into one overarching metric, biocapacity. This is the Earth's actual ability, measured in global hectares, to provide resources and absorb our waste. When our direct and indirect footprints exceed the Earth's biocapacity, unsustainability occurs. And when that happens, we begin racking up a highly dangerous greenhouse or carbon debt. Which brings us to our final part. Section 4, Global Climate Action. Geopolitics and targets. Let's look at the massive global mechanisms designed to manage this debt. Managing a global crisis obviously requires global players. You have the IPCC, the independent body serving as the total gold standard for credible climate science. Then the Rio Conventions from 1992, which set the foundational global agreements on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. And then you have highly motivated groups like AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. This is a coalition representing the low-lying nations that are literally the most vulnerable to rising sea levels. And they are constantly pushing the global community for urgent action based on the IPCC science. Now, the way these coalitions actually get things done is through some pretty dense bureaucratic mechanisms. QLROs are legally binding emission targets for developed countries. But to meet these strict targets, developed nations can use the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. Basically, this allows them to finance emission reduction projects in developing countries, which earns them carbon credits, known as CERs, to offset their own mandatory limits. And they're doing all this while also trying to prevent accidental fugitive fuel emissions during transport. It is a lot to juggle. But the global market is wildly interconnected, and it creates this crazy phenomenon known as spillover or rebound effects. It's like a giant puzzle. When developed nations cut their emissions, global demand and the price of oil drop. Developing nations naturally buy up that cheaper oil to fuel their own economic growth, which increases their emissions. As a result, up to 20% of the original greenhouse gas cuts made by those industrial countries effectively leak right back into the atmosphere. And this complexity is compounded by something called hot air. If an emissions target is set too easily, a government can meet its goal with minimal effort. They are then rewarded with excess emissions credits, which they sell, flooding the global market. This severely reduces the financial incentive for other countries to actually do the hard work of cutting their own domestic emissions. It accidentally stalls genuine climate progress. But listen, despite all the jargon, the offsets, the spillover effects, it all really comes down to this single stark number, 450. To maintain the goal of limiting global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the absolute threshold to even have a 50% chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change, 450 parts per million of CO2 equivalent is our absolute atmospheric limit. It is the ultimate ceiling of our global carbon diet. We started out today looking at the delicate baselines of nature. We moved through human innovation, and we went right up to the massive geopolitical mechanisms trying to save those baselines. So I want to leave you with this thought. With our global biocapacity stretched to its limits and that 2-degree goal looming over us, will the complex climate policies we've explored today actually outpace our mounting greenhouse debt? Thank you so much for exploring the science and the policy with me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.